Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to Shasta College Humanities as we go through the humanities through the ages. What's different about this time around is I'm doing music from Mozart to contemporary music. We probably will keep going until early next week when I do the origins of rock and roll and the origins of hip hop world. We'll probably stop it there. It's a great subject. It tells us who we are, about our story, our collective story, at any time in our history. Whatever's going on with pop music is what usually is going on in the culture. And the culture was exploding after World War II. People were coming back from the largest scaled war in human history, and they came back changed. Writers, movie directors, painters, musicians all came back changed because the world had changed. They'd seen a lot of these were World War II vets, these musicians, and they had seen a lot that they never thought they'd see. The inhumanity to man, as it were. And so everything was changing during this time. This was also we're having our Cold War with, at the time, Soviet Union. We were arming ourselves to the teeth with nuclear weapons, as were they. It was what they call the Cold War. We're not in a hot war. Hot war would be, actually shooting each other. Cold War is just always there, the threat. Never having to shoot each other. We're just threatening to blow each other up. We came close, 1962, at the Cuban Missile Crisis, but no cigar. Anyway, the veterans are coming home. They had been off to war. Sometimes it was the only time they'd ever been out of America, U.S. They were fighting in the Pacific. They saw ugly, ugly things. They saw phenomenal things. They were fighting Nazism in Europe, and they saw ugly, ugly things, and they saw things that were phenomenal. They were fighting in historical cities in Paris, in Rome, Berlin, and they were shooting bullets instead of going to art galleries. So it was warfare at the highest order, slaughter of the highest order of the innocents, not just soldiers in the field, but people in London had been bombed on by Germany, innocent people, women and children. It was the first time a major nation had taken the war to the general populace. That's how desperate the Nazis were to defeat everybody. Didn't work. And so all the savagery was going on, and these young men are fighting it, and they came home. Guess what, folks? They lived. They lived through it. And now they're changed. And so things are really different in the country now. They came back to a country that they didn't recognize. It's hard to go off to war, come back after 4 years, and you lived, and you saw your best friends die, or maybe you were horribly wounded, either physically or mentally, and you had to come home, and you're supposed to just start off back life like nothing had changed. Get your old job back at Woolworths. There was no Costco in those days, but they had Woolworths. You just couldn't be a clerk anymore after you'd been in warfare. You'd maybe been a pilot of an airplane. How can you go back to regular life? It's not easy. But it was the first time in our culture where our returning veterans, we had this thing called the GI Bill, and it helped pay for first homes. It helped pay for cars, college, and they took advantage of it. I mean, my father came back from the war, and he bought his first house on the GI Bill. It cost $12,000. He paid $60 a month. The house is still around. Whoever lives in it now, it's worth a couple $100,000. But in those days, $12,000 was a lot of money. It enabled people to start building away from the cities. Suburbs were built, and further and further out, so they have room for their kids to roam on their bicycles without fear of being killed on the streets somehow by traffic. Or how do you get down to the suburbs? Well, you got to have a car, folks, to get to work, because you're working downtown, but you're living outside of town, maybe 10 miles outside of town. Then how does the wife get into town to do the shopping? Guess what? You buy two cars. So it's the first time in our history that we were able, a family, say a family of two living out in the suburbs, could afford two cars. And most of it came from low interest loans from the GI Bill. And we never had that kind of freedom before. Now, when that's going on, the art scenes are changing. Artists are coming home, and they had gone through hell and back, and they survived it, and now they're painting their life dependent on it. People like Jackson Pollock and other people, Andy Warhol, Willem de Kooning. Not that Willem didn't go into the war; he was not an American citizen, but I'm just saying the war changed them. The home country where de Kooning came from was bombed into nothing. And so that's going to change you as a human being, as an artist, and you're going to express that devastation through your art. When we get to contemporary artists, more contemporary than we've touched on already, we'll be talking about Pablo Picasso. We have to. That'll be in the weeks to come, not yet. And Picasso, his famous painting, Guernica, is something we're going to study. Maybe you'll have to write a paper about it. We'll see. And it's in 1936 when there's a Spanish Civil War against the dictatorship of Franco. And it was what you might call the Progressive Party against the uber conservatives, the dictatorship. But the dictatorship was supported by Adolf Hitler. And Hitler came in with his airplanes because Spain didn't have the planes, and he bombed the city of Guernica. They killed thousands of people in one moment, women and children, and turned it into cinders. And Pablo Picasso drew his most famous painting of that carnage out of his horror. And one day, I hope you guys get to Spain. I hope you go to the museum where they have all of Picasso's works. And you can sit in front of Guernica and see what horror looks like through an abstract painter. Well, not only was that happening, but writers were coming out of there. World War II writers, our mid-20th century writers, people like Jim Jones, writing The Thin Red Line, Norman Mailer writing The Naked and the Dead. I got to think of some authors now. Kurt Vonnegut writing the legendary Slaughterhouse-Five, Joseph Heller writing the wonderful Catch-22. These are major World War II novels that were written by soldiers coming out of the war. One of the greatest authors of that era was J.D. Salinger, who went on to write Catcher in the Rye and Franny and Zoe. He had been very, very affected from what he saw in the war. And he came back, and their books are haunted by the war. Whereas Catch-22 and Kurt Vonnegut wrote about it as a satire because they either laugh at it or it's going to drive them insane. The other novelists were very serious, and they did not laugh at it or with it or find the humor in it, but Kurt Vonnegut, bless him, did. And it makes it even more powerful. So when that's going on in literature, we have major change in filmmaking out of Hollywood. We'll get to the films later on in the semester. We'll do 10 days or so on movies. And the film directors who had gone off to war changed. They came back. Their movies went darker, meaning the themes were darker. They weren't just happy entertainment movies where everybody's having a great time, because they'd been through the war. They didn't have such a great time. And so they wanted to play that on the screen. So some wonderful post-World War II movies took place. Movies like On the Waterfront, Rebel Without a Cause, Humphrey Bogart movies, so many more. We'll talk about that later. These directors came back totally affected by the war, and they had to get their emotions out on the screen. One of the great returning war films, directed by William Wyler, Best Years of Our Lives, was done post World War II about veterans returning home, starring great Frederick March and Dana Andrews, Myrna Loy, and it's about veterans returning home to an America they didn't recognize. They put a human face on the returning veterans. Won all the Academy Awards. It's a wonderful movie, but it's not a happy movie. There's lots of pathos in it because these veterans had seen things, and they just can't go back to the hometown and business as usual, life as usual. It's impossible. Well, that was happening big time in music. During the 30s, we had big band music, Benny Goodman, and so many more others. They got us through World War II. Their dance bands, they were upbeat, kind of happy music, instrumentals, with a jazz background. Jazz started happening in the 20s. Jazz is an American form of music that was started in the early 20s and got more and more popular, kind of morphed into big band music, swing music, as you might have heard that term. People were dancing like crazy to dance their blues away. This is before, folks, before everybody was having internet sex. There was dancing. That's how essentially they had sex. The world was different. And so they danced like crazy to get the energy out of their young minds and bodies. And then when that didn't work, they got married and had sex, and they all had kids, which I'm a product of one. It's called the baby boom. Started in about 1946, went through 1964. It was the biggest birthing of children in this country we'd ever experienced because these soldiers had come back from the war and they're happy to be alive. And when you're happy to be alive, you hopefully have a lot of sex, maybe, if you're lucky. And this was in the day before real birth control. And so lots of kids were being born. Everybody I went to school with had at least two or three brothers and sisters. That was normal. Now, while all that's happening, the baby boom, the music is changing. It's coming out of World War II, the very end there, and there was some artists like Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis that was kind of riding the coattails of Louis Armstrong, and they were taking jazz into another realm, a more of an intellectual realm. They weren't trying to get you to dance. They were trying to depict what they were feeling inside, their emotions about living through the war, also living in the Cold War with the atomic threat all the time. Also, we still had civil unrest in this country because African Americans didn't have civil rights as much as white people did. And this is the area of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a bunch of racist laws put into effect in mostly southern states. Essentially, blacks had no rights in those states, and they could actually be hung and for looking at a white woman, simply looking at them, they could be hung, and they were. The term Jim Crow is a vaudeville term that they had of this character. Jim Crow was like a exaggerated dancing African American, a fool, sort of. And so it became known as the Jim Crow era. And that lasted, folks, till the 1970s. Don't think it went away. And a lot of people, including myself, are seeing some of Jim Crow still existing. Also, you have to look at the Black Lives Matter, look at that a little closer. Jim Crow is alive and well in this country now. Not just my opinion. Read up on it. Don't take my word for it. When this is happening, musicians were developing a new kind of music, a more intimate jazz with intimate combos of 4 or 5 pieces, piano, trumpet, saxophone, flute, drums, bass usually, throwing a guitar in there once in a while. And you could have a combo, and you could go into play small clubs in New York City and Harlem and elsewhere. And maybe get a small following. You could do some recording. And so some of these artists came out of this era that changed the face of music, changed the face of how we interpret instrumental jazz music. This was an intellectual time, folks. People were reading books, believe it or not, like crazy. The movies were smart. The artists were smart. They're painting. Jackson Pollock was painting his abstract paintings that you had to be engaged intelligently. People might have been smoking some reefer also to get a little edge off on the knowledge that they needed to get. They wanted to explore. There were some bad drugs around, like always, especially musicians. The great equalizer, heroin, was still very popular, and a lot of these musicians definitely were addicted to heroin. Some of it killed them. But they're also creating music that we never heard before. They were taking the elements of regular straight music and they're breaking it down. They're breaking time signatures down. They're breaking what we consider a melody. And there was a movement called Bebop. And if you listen to John Coltrane, that's a great saxophonist. That's about as good as definition of bebop as I could do. It's virtuoso playing, and sometimes it's atonal, sometimes there's no melody, but as an intellectual exercise, it was deep and wide, and it made people think. It didn't go over easy. You had to really be into the groove to get it. And one of the forefront runners of that was a genius, and I don't like saying that word often, but you got to say it when it comes to Miles Davis. He's a trumpet player who came through the jazz era, but he came of age right after World War II, and he really helped usher in this new form of jazz music where it took more of an engaged listener, not someone who just wants to hear music in the background while they're having a drink at the bar or dancing with a woman. You really couldn't dance to this stuff. You know, you could, I guess, but it wasn't dance music. And he made a couple legendary albums. Kind of Blue is his most legendary album, which he made later in the 50s. But before that, he was playing music with Dizzy Gillespie, another trumpet player. And in his band was Charlie Parker, saxophone player. And they were creating a new language. This jazz music of the 1950s was going places that no one ever heard before. Now, this is before rock and roll. And so the young youth were really digging it because it was rebellion. It was rebellion against the old stoic, staid, straight, square music of their parents. Jazz pushed the envelopes on rebellion. And if you're into jazz, you were probably into poetry. You're probably into smoking some reefer. You were probably reading some Norman Mailer, Naked and the Dead, and you were probably reading some poetry. Jack Kerouac, maybe On the Road, is full of nothing but jazz. And if you ever read, I hope you guys do, read On the Road by Jack Kerouac, you need to listen to jazz when you're reading it. You'll understand what he's going through, how important it was as something that the youth could hang on to that their parents didn't understand. And I'm going to tell you this is not just my belief. Music is a lot of times a rebellion against the other generation. Now, when my generation came up, I'll talk about that next week, it was rock and roll. Once the Beatles came out, Rolling Stone, their parents hated it because we all wanted to have long hair. We wanted to play guitars. We wanted to be those guys. And boy, did they not like it. I always feel that if your parents like your music you're listening to, you're listening to the wrong music. I think your parents should loathe the music you're playing because it's your job as a young person to piss your parents off. And rock and roll was a great way to rebel, and so was this jazz music of the 1950s. 50s were considered a conservative time in America only because of the politics. Dwight Eisenhower was our president. That on the TV was Leave It to Beaver. These are typical shows of the 1950s. It shows families living kind of a fairy tale fantasy. Really, life wasn't really like that. Donna Reed show. There was a bunch of them. Fathers Knows Best. These are shows of the 1950s. When we get up a little later, we'll be talking about some TV stuff, and this will be part of it. Later on in the course, I should say. And so the rebellion's out there, and the kids are looking for something to rebel. And this is before rock and roll, which was starting in the early 50s, but only mostly in the South. But really didn't get going until Bill Haley Comets came out, and then Elvis, of course. We'll talk about that later. But that's like 55, 54, and 55. I'm talking about 48, 49, 50 right now. And this new sort of music, and the people who were changing everything. And for the most part, they were black musicians, but there was a West Coast movement. It was called the Cool Sounds of the West Coast. Now, in New York and Chicago, Detroit, the more East-dominated music was more urban music. It was more angst-ridden music. Out here in California, it was more, guess what? Laid back. And a guy by the name of Chet Baker, who was a white saxophone player, who they called him the James Dean of jazz because he was a beautiful looking boy. He was playing mellow jazz. Miles Davis never liked it, but that's his issue. Chet Baker, I think, is wonderful. He was had a tragic life. Young, addicted to heroin, did all the bad boy stuff that musicians do. And he was assaulted outside of a nightclub at the height of his fame, and his front teeth were knocked out. Now, if you're a horn player without your aperture, which is your front teeth pushing up against the horn, you can't play the horn. And he couldn't play for months. Yes, he got false teeth, but they're not the same. He thought his career was over, but he learned to work around it. But it's like a guitar player losing his 4 or 5 fingers. You wonder how they're going to recover from it. Well, some do, some don't. He recovered from it, but it changed him forever. And he died tragically. He was on tour. He was I think, in his 50s. Shadow was a former self. He looked like crap, but he was still getting audiences in France. He was sitting on, supposedly, he was probably drunk and on drugs. He was sitting on the ledge of his window at a hotel, and he fell out. And so some people go he fell, some possibly believe maybe he jumped. We'll never know. But Chet Baker was a tragedy of the jazz era. Along those same lines, but not a tragedy, a guy who lived, I think, until 92 or so, because he just died in the last 5 years. Dave Brubeck. Dave Brubeck is actually from Stockton, California. If you go down to Stockton, there's a College of Pacific down there, and they have the Dave Brubeck Center. You could study music there, and it's under his name. And I think there's a uh, grant with his name on it. And Dave Brubeck was highly popular in the 50s. He actually had a couple of hits on the top 40 radio. One of them would be Take Five, uh, written by mostly his saxophone player, Desmond and Paul Desmond. And it's a haunting, beautiful song. Maybe you've heard it because they still play it. They play it in supermarkets. They'll play it on radio. They'll play it in a commercial on TV. Now, we're talking instrumental music here, not vocals. There was jazz vocalists, um, Ella Fitzgerald, Diana Washington, Billie Holiday, and they were legendary. Because in order to sing jazz, you got to be really fluid in your vocals. And to keep up with a jazz band is not easy. And these women did it in spades. And so there was vocals, absolutely. Uh, they got very, very famous. Billie Holiday is one of the most famous jazz singers in the history of music. Sad story. Once again, heroin addicted all her life, died young, and her voice is otherworldly in how she interprets the notes on these jazz songs. I'm going to assign you guys a documentary on jazz, so maybe you'll see some of these things. I'm not going to sign a paper yet because I'm still trying to catch up with grading your papers, and I'm guessing I won't assign a paper till early next week. See how it goes. But I want you guys to dwell into jazz, and I want you guys to pay attention to some names. One of them's Dizzy Gillespie, who ran a band for years and years. Horn player that a lot of these musicians came through his band. That's how legendary he was. At one time, Miles Davis played with him. Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, another incredible saxophone player who died young of drug addiction. I mentioned Chet Baker, Dave Brubeck, and those are just some of them. There was other ones like Charles Mingus. I can't go into them all because we don't have time. And they did incredible music. Innovators of the highest order. Watch the documentary. I'll post it on Canvas. You'll see it, and maybe you'll come to appreciate what jazz is. Maybe you saw the documentary that they did, Ken Burns did a couple years ago on jazz. It's too many parts for us to watch. It was through PBS. It's like a 6-part jazz thing, and he does the entire history from the start to contemporary jazz. And if you've never, even if you don't like this music, if you don't think you would like it, if you've never had the opportunity to see some jazz players at a small nightclub somewhere, please do. It's worth it. To see the interaction between the musicians and the audience and the live sound, it's really phenomenal experience. Whether you go, I don't like jazz music, well, okay, fine. But when you hear it live, it's not easy right now with the pandemic. I realize that. It changes things. And a lot of these guys put out live recordings, and I have a bunch of them. Because the interaction they have with each musician is incredible. I'm not a musician. I fancy myself as a mediocre rock and roll guitar player and singer. These guys are on another level. They know music inside and out, and then they twist it upside down, and it comes back out through their horns, through their piano, through the drums, and it's a whole other language that they're doing. Jazz has lost favor over the last many years. The practitioners of it now. Wynton Marsalis is probably most famous, and his brother Branford. But they're in big cities. For some reason, people in big cities appreciate that. They can make a living there. Branford or Wynton has a whole jazz at the Lincoln Center. He has a section on jazz that he runs. Not just jazz education, but jazz musicians coming through and trying to keep that wonderful music alive. Anyway, look at that documentary, watch this lecture, and just put some jazz on. See if you like it. You know you can find it. Go to your radio station. You guys all know. What are the radios? Spotify. Put in John Coltrane, and you may be surprised. Put in Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. It's beautiful, man. But it makes you listen. It's not background music. You have to listen to it. You have to think about it. You really do. And that's the beauty of it. So all this stuff is happening in the 50s. 50s are really happening. And yes, it's a Cold War. It's a conservative time politically. But things are happening in the art scene like never before. The mid-20th century is jumping. And it's jumping with painters and literature, plays, films, and in a few years, rock and roll, folks. And that changed everything. On that note, watch the doc, watch this, listen to some jazz. You may surprise yourself.